How's it going, American History 2 students? This is Mr. Bell coming at you with what should be your final video lesson for this crazy COVID-19 shutdown semester, which means this is your final warm-up. By my count, it's COVID-19 shutdown 41 or 42. The reason the numbering's off is because I think 2 of those days we actually didn't have a video with new warm-ups, 2 or 3 of those days. So this could be, it's either 41, 42, 43, 44, but that's my best estimate. But we're going to get through this warm-up, then we're going to hit 7.4, which is all the non-Cold War Reagan stuff, and that will be where we will end. And I'll talk to you a little bit at the end of this video lesson about your work this semester. What was linkage? This was Nixon's philosophy of improving relationships with communist China and communist Russia would improve relations with North communist in Vietnam, the Vietnamese. It did not work. What was the 17th parallel? It divided initially Northern Vietnam, ran by the Vietnamese and Ho Chi Minh, and South Vietnam, which was free, North Vietnam, which is communist. Of course, eventually the VC take over South Vietnam, and it all falls to communism. What was the credibility gap? This was the lying done to the American people regarding the Vietnam War. As revealed in the Pentagon Papers, Nixon promises he will close this. Of course, he doesn't. He just ends up lying more. Explain the 26th Amendment. This said you could vote at 18. It was a result of the deaths in the Vietnam War. The belief was that these people are old enough to die for their country. They should vote for the leaders that maybe send them to their death. So to review, linkage was improving relationships with communist China, as well as improving relationships with the Soviet Union would help with North Vietnam. It didn't. 17th parallel divides North and South Vietnam between communists and free at the beginning of the Vietnam War. The credibility gap was the line of the American people as revealed by the Pentagon Papers about the Vietnam War, mainly orchestrated by Lyndon B. Johnson. Explain the 26th Amendment, changed the voting age from 21 to 18. So let's get into our final section of notes, 7.4. Now, we've covered Reagan already as far as the Cold War is concerned. We'll review some of that, but this is going to cover more of his domestic policies. Reagan defined the Republican Party from his election in 1980 all the way up until about Donald Trump. He was the most famous and influential Republican president. It had been the Reagan Republican Party. Now it's been more defined, or redefined, I should say, as the Trump Republican Party. There was a return to conservatism across the country. You had Republicans do well up and down the ballot at state, local, federal levels due to the incompetence of Jimmy Carter and the charm of Ronald Reagan. Reagan's elected in 80 by a wide margin. He's reelected in 84, winning 49 of 50 states against Walter Mondale. There was this so-called moral majority in America, this idea that people wanted to get back, kind of like fundamentalism. People wanted to get back to a more conservative, more religious, more morally righteous form of leadership and government in the 80s. And there was a truth to that following the hippie movements of the 70s and 60s. There were several people who were the face of this, Reagan being one, Billy Graham, Jerry Falwell, who famously founded the Christian University in Virginia, Liberty, being another one. But they were very influential in politics at this time. The Reagan years would be described as a good time for most Americans, at least for the middle class and the upper class. He pulled America out of a terrible recession in 1982 by the biggest tax cut up until that point in American history. He cut the corporate tax rate and the individual top marginal tax rate by 23%. It was criticized at first by some, even his who ends up being his vice president and former political opponent, George Bush, who called it voodoo economics, but it would later be branded Reaganomics, and Republicans moving forward, including President Trump, would use it to great success. So what is Reaganomics? You cut the taxes for the rich. Specifically, you cut corporate tax rates. So let's take a company like IBM. If you cut IBM's tax rates by 23% and they're paying $500 million less a year, I'm just throwing these numbers out in taxes, then that's $500 million that they can take to hire more employees, open new places, make new products, be more experimental. Now, the argument against this is, what if they just sit on that money and they profit it? Well, that does happen with Reaganomics, but think about this. If IBM, because of the 23% tax cut, receives $500 million in tax cuts, and even if they sit on $400 million of it, that's $100 million they're putting out into the economy to create jobs, to create new plants, and just to inject life into the American economy. It works. It gets unemployment from the 8% to the 4%, which was at the time the greatest the economy had been post-World War II. Not everybody likes Reagan. There was an attempted assassination attempt by an insane man named John Hinckley. Reagan was shot. He was in the hospital for about 40 days. During this time, his vice president, George Bush 41, takes over, and he recovers, thank God, and finishes out that term and wins re-election on a second term. He is a Republican, and he is very conservative. He is very religious, but he has a knack to get along well with Democrats, including the Democratic Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, who forms a great relationship with President Reagan. Now, the biggest criticism of Reaganomics comes from two things. One, we were spending a ton of money trying to bankrupt the Soviets. Two, if you're going to cut taxes, you have to cut spending just to make the math add up. So what Reagan did was he cut welfare programs. He cut unemployment. He cut food stamps. He cut WIC. He cut Medicare. Not Medicare. He didn't cut Medicare. He cut Medicaid. So if you were poor during the 80s, you probably resented President Reagan and thought him to be a terrible president. But if you were wealthy or middle class or upper middle class, you probably remember Reagan as a fairly decent president. He appoints the first woman to the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor. He's criticized for not maybe focusing on the AIDS epidemic as much as he should. We talked about his strengthening the military, peace through strength, and trust but verify when we covered the Cold War Reagan stuff. The Reagan doctrine is peace through strength. It's not to start endless wars. In fact, Reagan avoids wars in several instances. In particular, there is a Marines barracks bombed by terrorists in Beirut, Lebanon, and he pulls the troops out of Lebanon without retaliation. Some consider this weak. Reagan considers it smart. He wanted to instill confidence back into the United States military that people had lost because of the Vietnam War. So he picks little fights that are easy victories to get the military's confidence back up. One of these being Grenada. Grenada is in South America. It had been taken over by communists. He sends the U.S. in there. They wipe out the communists in Grenada, restore freedom and democracy within a matter of weeks. It's with little casualties, and this is a huge success. Reagan parades the troops around like they just won World War II, which some people see as disingenuous, others see as a necessary to kind of recover from the blues of the Vietnam War. Iran-Contra affair. This was a scandal that's two-pronged that Reagan was caught up in. The Iran part, he was caught trading the arms for hostages, weapons to the Iranians to get our hostages out, as I mentioned in a previous video lesson. And the Contras, there was a group called the Contras in Nicaragua, and they were fighting against the communists there. And Congress had denied Reagan funding to aid the Contras to defeat the communists in Nicaragua. Reagan went ahead and did it anyway. He lied to the American people about it. So he is not without blemishes on his record. But people, even in his scandals, say, hey, you know what? He may have went about the wrong way, but his end goal was right, defeating communism. We mentioned Star Wars and SDI. Strategic Defense Initiative. Star Wars was the nickname given to it, of course, based off the popular movie that I'm obsessed with. Now, it was this idea of a space-based anti-ballistic missile system which would shoot down Russian nukes before they reached the United States. We weren't capable of it, but he made Russia think we were. They tried to create their own SDI. That on top of providing everything for everyone, being a true and pure communist nation that they were, couldn't keep up, and SDI is kind of the thing that really swings the pendulum in the favor of the United States during the Cold War. The Berlin Wall comes down. Now, Reagan goes to the wall and asks for it to come down. It actually doesn't come down until after he leaves office. Even though Bush was president then, Bush 41, it was Reagan's actions that led to that wall ultimately coming down, which had been a sign of oppression in Europe since World War II. The Cold War ends after several meetings between Gorbachev and Reagan and significant arms reductions. These were Perestroika, Glasnost. There was one other one as well. I can't remember. It may have just been Geneva. I'm not sure. But these were a series of meetings that Reagan and Gorbachev, who disagreed but respected one another, came to agreements on. Tragedies in the 1980s, as well as successes, were part of the space program. Sally Ride becomes the first woman in space. The Challenger disaster, in which a science teacher was the first civilian ever put into space, and this explosion occurs not too long after the rocket is beginning to leave Earth's atmosphere. Reagan has an immense part in this tragedy because he does such a good job comforting the American people during this time of tragedy, which is something that he was great at and seemed very genuine at. Of course, Reagan had been an actor before he ever became a politician, so some people viewed this as fake, others viewed it as authentic. It just kind of depending on how you felt about Reagan. If you really want to kind of get a view on Reagan, I would really encourage you to look up on YouTube the Reagan Challenger speech. Life in the 80s is defined by, especially the mid to late 80s, indulgence. Yuppies were people who would graduate college. You got a 4-year degree. You were almost guaranteed a great job at that time. You enjoyed success in life. You surrounded yourself with material things like cable TV, VCRs, and computers. VCRs predated Blu-ray and DVD players. Of course, you guys all use streaming now. Bill Gates creates Microsoft at this time, and Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs create Apple. You have the technology boom in Silicon Valley in California in the 80s. As mentioned here, the silicon chip leads to the name Silicon Valley, and this becomes a huge part of what boosts the 80s economy. And you really don't know the impact, especially of Microsoft, until you get to the 90s, and to Apple until you get to the late 2000s. Jobs was the face. He was the brand man of Apple. Wozniak was the behind the scenes. He was the coder who wrote all the Apple code. So that's going to do it for 7.4. So that kind of wraps up. You didn't get to learn from Bush 41 through Trump. So in a normal semester in which you were going to school through June, after this you would have had the Bush stuff in 7.5. You would have had the Clinton stuff in 7.6. And then Unit 7 Part 2 would have been Bush 43, then Trump, then Obama, and we may have mentioned Trump just a little bit, but since he's the current president, we probably wouldn't have got too much into it. It's kind of hard to judge that in a history class right now. So you did miss some stuff, but if you watched these videos, you got the main gist of what you needed to for American history too. I appreciate your time and effort during this crazy time for our country. I have mostly juniors. I know I had a few seniors who actually got to finish this class early. By my calculations, as you should know by now, this video has come out on May 27th, the Wednesday after Memorial Day. Here's my calendar here, my personal calendar I've been keeping. So this is the last day of school for students, so you do get to end a little early. If you have any questions about any of this stuff, if you need any recommendations next year for college, please don't hesitate to contact me. I've appreciated all your hard work and getting to know you as much as I could during the COVID-19 shutdown. During this semester, I'm sorry you guys missed out on so many in-class and in-school experiences this semester. It really makes me sad to think about. But if you have any questions, please email me at bsbell@clevelandcountyschools.org. Thank you, and have a great summer.